PowerPoint.
Yeah.
It's great. Thank you all so much for being here on this afternoon to listen to us talk. Thank you, Doug, for a really interesting talk that illuminated part of the history I didn't know about. So thanks. And thanks, of course, to Rabbi Kotzman for inviting me. And I guess the one who came up with, I think, such a great idea to use this holiday, which for many Jews isn't really a holiday, but we're off, so we might as well do something with it. So great idea. And I want to thank some people from, I'm a member of the LEAG here in The Hague. So I see some people from my congregation who heard a somewhat but similar lecture for the Levison Institute a month ago. So thank you for being here, and I have changed it a bit. When I give talks about Jews in the Caribbean, and that's really my area of expertise, I never quite know how far back, how much background to give. I give this talk a lot in the United States, where I'm originally from, where people have no idea where, honestly, Suriname or other places are. Yeah, sorry. Whereas, for a Dutch group of people based in the Netherlands, most people do. How far back in history to go or not. So I'm trying to find a sort of very Dutch polder model of how to give this. If I haven't gone enough into something and you have questions afterwards, I want to leave a lot of time for questions. I'm also around all afternoon, also for dinner, so feel free to come and chat with me. So yeah, and actually, I put Caribbean islands, but I already mentioned Suriname. Suriname's not an island. It's on the Caribbean, though. It's considered part of the Caribbean. So I won't just be talking about, I'll be talking about other places. Yeah, I just gave this whole disclaimer. How far back do I want to go? And I used to give this talk without going into this far back, so the 15th century. And people started asking me, like, okay, but where did these people come from? Who are they? So I want to, maybe history known to a lot of you, so I'll go over it pretty quickly, but I do want to touch on it. And this is important when I'm talking about this history, because I'm a historian, but also, as I'll talk about in a minute, the terms we're using for these people, and later for a very politicized debate about involvement in the trade in enslaved people. So, yeah, I think a lot of you know something about this history, the so-called convivencia, living together. Of course, it's very romanticized in history in medieval Iberia, Spain and Portugal. The idea that Christians, Jews, Muslims all live together in this peaceful, dominating this peaceful society under Muslim rule. It's not quite as clear cut as that, definitely not. But there were a lot of Jews, a lot of Christians, and a lot of Muslims in medieval Iberia. There had been a slow, what they call reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by Christian forces, till in 1492, the very end of this convivencia. So if you're from the United States, like I am, 1492 is marked by, okay, come on, what? Columbus, thank you. Actually, it's very interesting how intertwined these things are. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, but this end of convivencia, because in 1492, the last Muslim sort of city-state falls. Isabella Fernando, I'm speaking in multiple languages here, Dutch, English, Spanish, become the kings of, or queen of sort of united Spain. And they're very Catholic. They're known as the most very Catholic monarchs. And they say, okay, we can't have non-Christians in our territory. So Jews, but also Muslims, by the way, need to get out. They had 3 months to get out or convert. So there had been a slow process also of forced conversions already for a couple centuries. So they say, yeah, convert or get out. So you got 3 months, convert or get out. So we don't know how many Jews converted sincerely, not sincerely. We know a lot of Jews left, mostly to the domains under the Ottoman Empire, but quite a lot to nearby Portugal. It's close by. You don't have to sail. There's already a pretty large and entrenched Jewish community there already. So they go to Portugal. As many, between 50 to 100,000 Jews. 100,000 is a lot for that time. probably overestimated, but whatever. A lot of Jews go there. A lot go to Spain, or a lot go to Portugal. And this becomes also important for our story. Because this peacefulness in Portugal is also very short-lived. Actually, it lasts only 5 years when the Portuguese king, Manuel, wants to marry the daughter of the king and queen of Spain. They say, we're not marrying our daughter to someone who allows heretics, Jews in his kingdom. So, but the king of Portugal is actually a little less driven by ideological religious fanaticism as his neighbors in Spain, because he doesn't want to lose the Jews. I don't know how much he likes the Jews. He likes the Jews economically. He doesn't want to get rid of them. So he says, really, from basically one day to another, actually, all Jews in my kingdom are now Christian. Whereas in Spain, they said, you have to go yourself to convert and get out. He just says, yeah, there aren't any Jews in my kingdom anymore. They're all Christians. So this sets up a whole process of a division, of a creation of this separate group in Portuguese society. Yeah. So these people become known as new Christians because they're new to Christianity. In Portuguese, they're called cristãos, new Christians. So, yeah, we don't know how many people really, we do know some Jews also left. Like, no, I'm not a Christian. No, bye. They go to, North Africa, to other places under Ottoman rule. But we know a lot stayed. Probably the majority stayed in Portugal, being new Christians. They may have thought, hey, this is going to pass pretty quickly, whatever, we just left Spain, we don't want to move again. We don't know. We do know, we don't know how many, but that some Jews in Spain, but also particularly in Portugal, were what's so-called crypto Jews. So they practiced rites in secret, certainly in the first, possibly second generations after these forced or declared conversions. A lot of you have heard about that in history, or even family legends about Jewish practices. So we know that. They're also known as conversos. So in Spanish, Portuguese too, they're very similar languages. People, converted ones, people who've been converted. But also, this is particularly in Spain, this term marrano, which is a medieval Spanish derogatory term for pig. So it's used very much to insult Jews or people of Jewish ancestry. So this, as I said, becomes interesting. You may, if you read books about this, or even go yourselves into the archives, are terms for people of Jewish ancestry, but it becomes really important later in my talk when we're talking about, as I said, entanglement with the trade and enslaved people, that they're politicized. Yeah, so who is a Jew? It becomes, an interesting discussion. And yeah, so we've got these people who are told suddenly you're Christians. And what we also know, and sometimes this is, I think, painful for historians of Jews, most of whom, like me, are Jewish ourselves, when we look in the archives to find how many of these people, certainly 50 years, 60 years after this conversion in 1497, we want to believe that everyone kept this crypto Jewish identity. They kept practicing these rites and rituals in secret. We know that a lot of these people didn't. Certainly, as I say, the second, third, fourth generation, because they really want to become part, suddenly, because now they're Christians, albeit new Christians, they can be part of Portuguese society in a way that Jews couldn't. So they can, marry old Christians. They can become part of guilds, for instance. So they have economic opportunities that they didn't. However, as Jews know from history, this was relatively short-lived, because already by 1536, and I'll show you in a minute, you have the institution of the Portuguese Inquisition. Because there's this fear, and we hear about it throughout, again, resonances throughout Jewish history, that the Jews are too present. Now we can't tell because they can marry old Christians. They're not being separated from all these professions. So wait, there could be Jews everywhere, and we don't know that they're Jews. And of course, the Iberians as well, Spanish and Portuguese, are very concerned with something they call limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. And by that purity, they mean Catholic, Christian blood. They don't want it tainted, literally, with Jewish blood. When you start looking at Inquisition archives, they're great for a historian wanting genealogies. They go down to 3, 4, again, resonances with later history of generations of how much new versus old Christian blood you have. So I'm talking about this, it's interesting, but what it means is that these people of new Christian descent, no matter with this promise of being fully integrated, aren't. They get pushed into trade, guild, well, not guild, they get pushed into trade, into areas economically and socially that Portuguese old Christians aren't involved with. That means basically overseas trade, because at the same time, we talked about Christopher Columbus, but the Portuguese are actually really at the vanguard of overseas exploration, colonization as well. You see, this is the Portuguese Empire in the 16th century, very early. They're going all over, and these new Christians, these people of Jewish descent, basically by economic necessity, social necessity, get pushed into being very involved in the Portuguese overseas expansion trade as well, which becomes important for our story. I already talked about the Inquisition. So you have this being pushed into being involved in overseas burgeoning colonial trade because of being basically socially excluded in Portugal because of your ancestry. But also because I mentioned the Inquisition, because of this fear. Wow, gosh, there's these people and they look like us, but their blood is tainted. Not the only reason, by the way, the Inquisition gets established so strongly, but one of them. So you also have heightening inquisitorial persecution, which also pushes more people of new Christian descent to go overseas to get away from it. By the way, there was a branch of the Inquisition set up in Brazil quite early on, because so many of these new Christians, Portuguese new Christians, go to Brazil, kind of get away. They send the Inquisition to Brazil. Fascinating. They also send it, by the way, to Angola, looking for Jews. Not only Jews, by the way, they're also very concerned with the Protestant heresy, which, as you know, is coming up. So you've got this stuff going on, right? And then I don't have to tell this audience very much. I cut less minutes some of these slides. I guess everyone here, most people know something about the Dutch colonial empire. You know about the so-called 80 Years' War. Everyone else calls it the 30 Years' War, but whatever. You know that this background with the Dutch Republic fighting against the Habsburg monarchy. The Dutch start getting involved in overseas trade as well. So you have more and more of these Portuguese new Christians, people of Jewish descent. We don't know. Keep in mind that now we're basically at the end of the 16th century, so we're over 100 years after this forced conversion. We know they start coming to Antwerp, slowly coming into the Dutch Republic. Probably again, they're already involved in the colonial trade in gemstones, but also sugar. They start working with Dutch Protestant merchants in Antwerp. And this is, I wrote my first book about it. It's still, I got to tell you, it's a mystery to historians. We know people of new Christian descent start by 1595 or in Amsterdam. And then again, this story, I think a lot of you all know, wow, by 1618, there's 3 synagogues. Now, if you're part of a Jewish community, the fact that there's 3 synagogues for like 200 people shouldn't surprise you. It does surprise my Christian colleagues, friends. Like, how come you didn't just form one? Anyway, so you get more and more Jews coming, or people coming to, especially Amsterdam, and reclaiming this Judaism, rediscovering the Judaism. And again, in the historiography, some people look at it like, yeah, they were all crypto Jews and have been practicing and just waiting for the opportunity to be open Jews again. Some probably were. We don't know how many. Others may have seen it, and this is the most heretical. the most controversial theory. Some historians claim that actually probably these people did have some new Christian ancestry, but they realized that in Amsterdam, it was better to be a Jew than a Catholic. Also an argument, because we know the Catholics complained very bitterly by the end of the 17th century when, I don't have a picture, but you all know the beautiful, the beautiful Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam. A huge synagogue in the middle of Amsterdam. It was a tourist attraction, but the Catholics still have to pray officially behind closed doors and without haircut. So who knows? There's all sorts of factors going on, but we know, as you all know, the story that these Sephardic Jews, these people of new Christian descent, of Jewish descent, can become Jews basically in Amsterdam. Great, but you're probably going, but yeah, but we were talking about the Caribbean. So I've been spending however long, 10 minutes, 15 minutes talking about this. Get to the sunny part. All right. So I showed you, well, I'll go back really quickly. We've got the Dutch colonial empire. We know that present day Indonesia is considered the jewel of the empire, but it doesn't actually get sort of settled by Dutch people. It's the VOC, the Dutch East India Company has what they call factories. So basically like places where they trade, Batavia now, Jakarta. But they don't really try to settle in what's now a very loaded term, settler colonialism, until much later. But they do want to do that in the Americas. And why? They want to counter the Spanish and Portuguese. They're really running behind the Spanish and Portuguese, but also who are those other enemies of the Dutch? The British. Thank you. We fight 4 Anglo-Dutch wars. 4. So they're also wanting to counter the British for control of this land, this whole area. So yeah, but the problem is no one wants to go settle there. They don't. Why? Because you're gonna die. Yeah. Well, sorry, what did you say? It's far. You might die of disease. Also, yeah, I mean, it's not called the golden age for nothing. Things are actually going really well in the Dutch Republic, economically, relatively. We know, for instance, that probably a third of sailors on Dutch East India Company ships are from Scandinavia or the German states because they can't get enough Dutch people to go. Why would you go? You're going to die. You're going to get sick, whatever. So they can't get people who want to go and settle in these places. So actually, it's not just the Dutch, it's also the English who say, ooh, but you know who might go? The Jews. The Jews might go. So why would the Jews go? Well, because they're offering them more freedom, more autonomy than they had in Europe, certainly anywhere in Europe, even in the relatively tolerant Dutch Republic. So they have complete autonomy over their congregation, which I'll talk about a little later, causes all sorts of issues later. But yeah, they don't have to take a Christian oath. They get tax exemptions. They don't have to show up in court, for instance, on a Jewish holiday. They have greater rights to trade. This one always freaks people out if they don't understand right to serve in the militia. And I bring up the example of Rembrandt's Night Watch, which is of Amsterdam's Burgervacht, right? And those are the prominent men. That's why I have Rembrandt paint this beautiful, huge thing. So actually serving in the militia is also an honor. It shows that you belong. It shows that you, granted only for men, it shows that you're part of the society. And Jews were excluded. So the right to serve in the militia is actually a really, you can ask questions later. But definitely, I'm going to leave time. But you can serve in the militia shows that you belong. In fact, one of the few Ashkenazim, and I'll talk about later, in what's now New York, New Amsterdam, Asher Levy, actually sued to serve in the militia very early on. You can own estates. Keep in mind at this point, even in tolerant Amsterdam, officially, Jews can't own property. So if you look at the records for the first synagogue, it's actually done through, interestingly, one of the magistrates of Amsterdam, who's the official owner. So you can own estates, fully clear, and rights to own enslaved people as well. So the Dutch offer this to Jews as an incentive to get them to settle. The British follow, or English follow, not too far behind. And I have to say, it's not just in Amsterdam. It's also they nail this to the synagogue door in Livorno, for instance. They really want these Sephardic Jews. They want them also because, well, they're known to have these trade contacts. They keep contact with their relatives, often many of whom are not actually openly practicing Jews, but who are actually Catholics. They know the languages. So they're considered really desirable because of these connections, these networks, this linguistic skill, this background in this colonial trade. And they gambled very, very correctly that the Jews would stay. And this is also a big problem. I say that everyone wants settlers. They want settlers because most people go, they try to make their fortune. It's mostly single men who go, and they don't stay. So it's a problem actually to get people to stay. Actually, the mid 18th or 17th century governor of 18th century of Suriname once called it the desire to return, as in go back to Europe. They have a real issue, but they gambled correctly that the Jews would stay. And by the beginning of the 18th century, you have Jewish settlements all over the Atlantic world. Some of you may have heard of these places, and I should say, a friend of mine from my congregation, Jerry, for those of you know, who's from Ireland, complained bitterly about this. He was absolutely right. He's saying that Northern Ireland division wasn't there at the time. He's right. Jerry's not here, but just letting you know, map's not completely correct with that. But you can see where there's Jewish settlements or communities that basically are all over the Atlantic world. We've forgotten in the Netherlands about some of these places like Demerara, they're in what's now French Guiana and Guyana, but they were Dutch sugar producing settlements, Berbice as well. And also actually on the smaller islands, St. Eustatius, and the other ones, there are Jewish congregations, Jewish communities in these places. But so they're all over. Actually, I mentioned the British. They're in Jamaica. They're in Barbados. They're in St. Thomas, which was Danish. So they're all over. But it's really now, when I talk to colleagues who are very focused on the Jewish Caribbean, English Jewish Caribbean, they can contest this. But the biggest and most vital communities are in the Dutch territories. So that's basically Curacao and Suriname. Suriname, as most of you know, I put this for those North American audiences, is a sugar producing colony. It was actually mostly fought over. People forget the Jews first came to Suriname under the English, Lord Willoughby, when it was Willoughby's land. As part of these Anglo-Dutch wars, the Dutch basically take it over. They trade it in part, not only for what's now New York, in what some people consider the worst trade ever. At the time, it made sense. Yeah, exactly, very much. But at the time, beaver skins versus sugar, it seemed like a great trade. Who knows? But yeah, so Suriname mostly an agricultural plantation economy, and Curacao. Actually, the English didn't want, or Spanish had control over Curacao and also Aruba and Bonaire. They called him the Islas Inutiles, the useless islands. They never did anything with them, so the Dutch basically took them over. And the Spanish were wrong because you can't really grow anything on Curacao, but it has a fantastic, those of you who've maybe visited have seen it, fantastic deep water port. It becomes a transshipment point for colonial goods, what's called a free port, a lot of illegal shipping, transshipment of enslaved people to the Spanish mainland. So yeah, this is where Jewish life in the Caribbean really blossoms, although to a lesser extent also in Barbados, also in Jamaica with the English. And what do Jews do whenever we get a place? We fight with each other, but we also form communities. We also have synagogues. These are the two big ones. maybe some of you've been there, Mikveh Israel, now Mikveh Israel Emmanuel and Willemstad, still there. You see that Dutch colonial. Neve Shalom and Paramaribo. I was just there a couple months ago. I don't have a picture here of it's now in ruins, the one in what's called Yoda Savannah in the interior of Suriname. That was the first that we know of, at least since the diaspora, completely agricultural Jewish colony in the interior of Suriname, which flourished for about 150 years.
I'll send you the picture.
Good. Yeah. Excellent. Were you just there too? No.
Yes.
Yeah, I was, yeah. Anyway, we can't really see because of the light. So maybe some of you have been there. What's unique about the synagogues in the Caribbean? That pull out for me. Why? Why are there sand floors? I shouldn't ask for so there's different legends. Also, yeah. So there's legend. No one knows. I'll cut to the chase. No one knows. There's different legends. One legend has to do with commemoration of the 40 years wandering in the desert. Okay. The other legend comes indeed from this crypto-Jewish heritage of practicing rituals in secret and basements to dampen the sound. Other people say that it's about cleanliness, like you can sweep the sand away. You do that in old pubs in the Dutch Republic. We don't know, but it's typical not just in the Dutch, also if you go to the Sephardic synagogues in Jamaica, other places, yeah. So we don't know, but they're there. Yeah, exactly. I know, and so that's why people say, yeah, it's actually from the mud. You can sweep it out. Sweep it away. Yeah. So they form these synagogues, right? So, we can chat. Hold on, we got 11 minutes. So, mostly focusing I'll do some of the broad similarities with the English, but let me tell you about the communities and why it's important. I've already gone through that history. But what I think is really interesting and what a lot of people don't realize is because the English and the Dutch gambled successfully, the composition of the community is a third to a half of the white population in these Caribbean colonies. Now, keep in mind the white population is a tiny minority, and African descended, enslaved, free people of color is by far the majority. However, making up a third to a half of the white population is incredible. You can get, if you want to talk about later, the legacies of colonialism, what that means in terms of basically buying social status, becoming white figuratively. There's all sorts of interesting things in there. So, it doesn't seem like a lot of people, but actually when you look at the influence of being that much of the white, which are basically de facto ruling people in a colony, that means a lot. There's still actually some of these families, especially mostly in Curacao, I should say, they tend to intermarry. We can talk about some of what that means in the 19th century in terms of a lot of genetically transmitted diseases, and they're fractious. Nice word in English means argumentative. So we know a lot about the community, especially in Curacao from the 18th century, because they're fighting with each other all the time. Sounds familiar, perhaps, to those of you who are part of a Jewish community. However, so they're fractious, and I want to then in a minute talk about some of these conflicts, particularly around admitting African descended Jews and about more obscure religious issues. But I do this especially for my audiences in the United States. In the United States, well, it won't surprise you, thinks it's the center of everything anyway, all the time. And Jewish history in the United States is taught very much from basically 1880 onward. So people like my great-grandparents who leave Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement, they come to the US, they do good, they make good. That's where American Jewish history began. It's very Ashko-normative, centered on Ashkenazi history. So they're very, very surprised when you see, this is all from the late 18th century. That is the time I could get the most comparable numbers, and actually this is when these populations are already starting to decline. But you see how many more Jews are in the Caribbean than are anywhere in North America. And what does this mean? Other than challenging this idea that in the Americas, it all starts, in the latter part of the 19th century in the United States. It means the Caribbean is really the center of Jewish life in the Americas until really the mid 19th century. Ashkenazim had to join the Sephardic congregations until really into the 19th century. One of my favorites is the kosher verification was done in the Caribbean. Most foodstuffs in the Caribbean are actually coming from North America, from what's now the United States or Canada, including beef, wheat. But it's verified mostly in Curacao for a long time. And you get all these nasty letters back to Sheriff Israel and to the United States saying, yeah, we found some pork in this meat, and but the verification is done in the Caribbean. And you have this sort of rotation of rabbis, some of whom are actually born in the Caribbean and who are basically exchanged in the Caribbean and in North America. So that's kind of interesting in itself. We've got Spinoza being banned. That's interesting in of itself, but it's also interesting. And what I've been thinking about more, I'm a social cultural historian. I'm not someone who looks a lot, or I have to admit, I've ignored religion a lot in this story, also my own research. I've looked at, trade, I've looked at interactions with people of color, with non-Jews, I've looked at all this social and economic stuff. And I've really ignored the religious stuff because I've also had this view that basically, these people were satellites of the Amsterdam and later the London communities. Religiously, they followed what they did, and there you go. That basically religiously, the Caribbean is not that interesting. And I'm stepping away from that because I think I'm looking more into it and I'm discovering more how it is interesting. So I put this one of Spinoza being excommunicated, banned, because I couldn't find another good picture. I started thinking about this for a few reasons, but one was how often the communities would ban people that are in, but not like the Spinoza forever and ever, amen, but for a couple days or for a month. How many sort of religious infractions there supposedly were, the punishments they were imposing on people, and how many conflicts there were around that. So that made me start thinking about it. Now, some of you heard of the Lulav already. There was a very controversial rabbi in the mid 18th century who came to Curacao, to Sola, and he was sent from Amsterdam. And there's just endless conflicts with him. And, we've looked at that, he was a really difficult guy, and blah, blah, blah. But as I've started looking at it more, I realized, he might have been difficult, who knows? But actually, all the conflicts are about him trying to impose norms, religious norms, from Amsterdam or from normative religious practice, at least as practiced amongst the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam, on this community that had been there almost 100 years and had started doing their own thing religiously as well. So the Great Lulav controversy. So I'm speaking to a largely Jewish audience. I don't have to explain Sukkot. Usually I go through my whole thing. Right? I don't have to go through that as much. But yeah, so he comes to Curacao, and apparently in Curacao, the Lulav and Sukkot, apparently they were shaking it in the wrong direction. He didn't like the direction in which they were doing the thing. So yeah, hey, you gotta get what you can. But no, so they weren't doing the right direction, but also they were using native grown foliage. And so he comes in and says, nope, you can't do that, whatever. And the congregation basically gets in an uproar. They basically try to dethrone him, get rid of him. There's all this back and forth with Amsterdam. Amsterdam backs the Sola, the congregation, and even sends examples from Amsterdam of the right vegetable material. They send it back, and it goes on and on. On the boat, but no planes. It just goes, but it years back and forth, back and forth. And yeah, the other big thing, De Sola is really a stickler. Apparently, it had become the custom, and maybe some of the more religiously learned here, it had become the custom in the Caribbean communities to ignore the prohibition for men shaving between Pesach and Shavuot, which is coming up. They were like, no, it's too hot here, so we don't do that. He tried to impose that big thing. So basically, he's coming in and reacting to what he saw as laxity, religious laxity, not being strict enough. They saw as a unique expression of Caribbean Judaism, right? So we're seeing that playing out there. This is not actually the Siddur. I couldn't find the picture, but I want to give one other example in case those of you who read Hebrew well enough to see. We also, yeah. Previous slide. Oh, this is actually, you can see it in Etz Chaim, the library in Amsterdam. I guess most of you know this. So this is David Aboab, who's was someone from Curacao, long-standing family there. Maybe some of you know the Aboab name just in general with the Portuguese community. So he writes this. This is the first page of it in Hebrew. I've told that Hebrew is a bit wonky, but my Hebrew myself isn't good enough to judge that. So he writes an account of the Lulav, the Sukkot controversy, to argue the case of the community in Curacao. He's arguing for why they weren't wrong with the direction and everything they're doing. So it's those. He was based in Curacao. He actually comes to Amsterdam. So thanks actually for reminding me to tell you more. Writes this. He's rejected, and then it ends up in Etz Chaim. So if you read Hebrew well enough, my Hebrew is mwah. It is really interesting to read his account of it, which also has a lot of personal vendetta in it, a little less religious, a little more about the personal. Won't surprise you. So
see the whole thing about the bad.
Yeah. Suspicious. So there's also one of these rabbis that was circulating around. He'd actually been in Dutch Brazil, and I've ignored the whole story of Dutch Brazil because I don't have time. We can talk about it. Isaac ben Matthias Aboab, already in 1687, wrote his own sort of prayers, including rituals for circumcising male slaves. I won't go tons into this. I've talked to some of you all about it before. My colleague at Potsdam, Jonathan Schwartz, who actually will be here in July, has written the book, the main thing looking at Jewish views towards enslavement in the early modern period. He's a rabbi himself, so he really goes into all the halachic, all the ritual and religious stuff. But we do know that a different Aboab, it's a very common Sephardic name at the time, did write special prayers responding to the special circumstances of the amount of enslavement, basically in the Caribbean amongst Jews. So he wrote special prayers for circumcising male slaves and ritually immersing female slaves. Now, some of you who know something about this know that those were already there for ancient times to some extent, what the rules about holding slaves, what you could do. But of course, it becomes a much bigger issue in the Caribbean, which is based upon much of the economy, much of the society is ultimately based on holding enslaved people. So you also see, and as I say, other people have looked at this more, but you see basically a Jewish religious response to this in terms of prayers, in terms of, what you do with these people, but also and this is where things become also quite, I think, politicized and difficult. Also, how many children are born with African descended women, enslaved or free from Jewish Sephardic men. This is especially the case, I have to say, in Jamaica, but also in Suriname. And some of you who know something about the Caribbean, the Dutch Caribbean, know that this legacy is there to this day. You have a lot of people with African descended, but who are also Jewish. We know, and I haven't gone into this talk, but we can talk more about it. We do know in the 18th century, the African descent, they're considered Jews. Once I gave this talk 10 years ago, I was young and naive, and I was just talking about, yeah, you know, they have their own synagogue. And someone said, yeah, but they're not Jewish. Okay, I'm not going to talk about halakha. I'm going to talk to you about how this community viewed these people. And they did. And again, this is a religious or lack of religious response to the conditions. The community does say, okay, they're Jewish. And you see that actually a lot with the Sephardim in the 17th century in Amsterdam as well. That was more children born with female Christian servants who are eligible to receive what's called the dotar, the dowry, that's set up for Portuguese Jewish girls. You do see that very Iberian, actually, whatever the halakha says, Jewish tradition says, actually, you know, the Judaism is passed on through the man. So it's an interesting dynamic there. But in Suriname, especially, much less so in Curaçao, but it does exist there. You have this group of African descended Jews who are considered Jews by the community, though let's not make it sound better than it was, second-class Jews. They're called, instead of in Portuguese, congregantes, they're called congregantes, not Yehudi. So they're sort of second class. There's a lot of dynamics around that as well. What I will say, the estimates vary between 2%, Jonathan Schwarz says, and Vika Vink, 10% of Jews of some African descents in the 19th century. So still not by any means the majority of Jews in the colony, but some. So the fact that they are being accepted as Jews in some way or another does this say something about the religious acceptance, lack thereof, whatever in the community. And one last thing on this, I've ignored the British colonies a lot because Dutch audience. We do know, of course, there's a lot of children born of Sephardic men and African descended women in Barbados, particularly, but also Jamaica. What we know is that some of these men sent their children to Suriname to undergo, for the girls, immersion in the mikvah, and for the boys, circumcision. So we do know that Suriname is being considered somehow a ritual religious center for these practices. And this is done with the hopes that the community in Barbados or in Jamaica will accept these children as Jews, like they do in the Dutch Caribbean. That's not the case, actually. One of the most famous one, or wealthiest ones, sends then his children to London, and they later actually marry into the Sephardic elite there. But they aren't considered Jews in Barbados. It's an interesting also dynamic between differences between these Jewish communities and how they deal with this issue. And yeah, these are some of the regulations. I won't go into it because my time's running out. And I want to allow a lot of time for questions. But and you all have been listening for a long time too. But what you see if you start looking at what's called the Ascomont, the bylaws of the congregations throughout the Caribbean, you start seeing a change. Here I put, I can even send you the PowerPoint. You start seeing a change with how they're dealing with, this is what they call it, mulatto Jews. It's considered a bit of an offensive term now, but Jews with some African descent. So you start seeing a change in how they're dealt with from not being discussed at all or it being a non-issue. That's where you start seeing also the probably how much greater this population is becoming, how much bigger, because they start showing up more and more in the bylaws. So that's what I've got to say. We have 10 minutes for questions or less? Don't know. I'm looking for a rabbinic authority. All right, quick question.
Question, Mike doesn't come. You just said that the center was Suriname and Curaçao.
The center population-wise,
Yeah.
but also, and this is what we're discovering a little more of, ritually, religiously, in terms of that kosher verification, that, you know, how you make people Jewish, that kind of thing.
Like Dutch, how Dutch was it?
Not at all. Well, that gets very interesting questions, which I guess we'll talk about later, of identity. It becomes an issue actually later in the 19th century. So these people have maybe lived in the Dutch Republic and then come to the colonies. A lot are coming from other places like Hamburg, London, where it's Livorno, where there's Sephardic Jews. Some are coming from Dutch Brazil. But yeah, how Dutch is anyone at that time, especially, and I'm not just being facetious here. It's like, yeah, it's very regional. They in the beginning, maybe later, that's the thing, they actually just stay there for 150 years. So they basically stay there. They're the longest running group or longest staying group. It becomes an issue in the 19th century with abolition for other reasons. And you start really getting this thing like they're not even Dutch. They're not, that same thing about Jews as well. They're not loyal to the crown. Yeah, but Dutch, the elite will speak some Dutch, but they don't stop using Portuguese until official emancipation in 1825, and they're forced to start writing their minutes in Dutch. Until then, it's in Portuguese. So yeah. Should I take questions? 1, 2, 3, and then I can talk later. Yeah.
The title of the book is Jewish Pirates.
No, it comes up every single time. The worst book ever. It's absolutely historically inaccurate. Yeah, I mean, there can be some new Jewish sailors or sailors of English or New Christian descent, but his whole thing about revenge on the Spanish crown for the Inquisition is it's absolutely not valid. And people like me also resent him because it's a bestseller. And I write these books that no one buys. And so there's also some jealousy, but no, it's historically absolutely not accurate. Yeah. Yeah. So not really. I mean, you have some small. This is actually which I didn't touch on. You have some Jewish. About 6% of the initial investors in the Dutch West India Company are Jews. But yeah, no. He also he takes the pictures from the tombstones with that means they're merchants. That doesn't mean they're pirates. Or the skull and crossbones. That means like mortality. So no. Yeah, well, I know I'm also Jewish. I mean, my son, when I was 6, he's 22 now, said, "Mama, when are you going to write a book people want to read?" He's still waiting. He just got his bachelor's and he's still waiting.
He does touch the subject, and I went.
Are you defending it?
No. Oh, I know you.
Much like the early Jews in Amsterdam. Yeah. Yeah, well, let's yeah. Go. Nope. Columbus.
Is it true? Because I read it somewhere.
Yeah, it's come up again because of the latest, a couple of months ago.
Ireland protected from the Holy Office of the Inquisition because of Columbus's family. A year ago or 2 years ago, it was proven that he.
Very, very debatable. And yeah, then you get also into the of essentialism and whatever. In terms of protection from the Holy Office, I haven't heard that. I mean, the Inquisition is not allowed to try, or because it's an official legal arm, it's not officially allowed to try Native Americans. They are actually protected by the crown, basically. So that would have more to do with the original native population than any blood of Columbus. But yeah, no, the Columbus thing is also a bit suspect for all sorts of reasons. And even if he has some Jewish ancestry, usually in this, I alluded to this politically about the trade in enslaved people. It's almost always brought up for this idea of original sin, basically, that you see the original sin of colonization in the Americas is because of a Jew. So I'm very, as a Jew, but also as a historian, I'm very suspicious of all these, oh, he's a Jew. And that's the same, I've talked about all these terms with you especially get these discussions of the Jews were overrepresented in trade and enslaved people. That's not true. And when it's brought up, it's almost always people with some Jewish ancestry somewhere who were involved in Portuguese overseas expansion. They were probably very believing Catholics after however many generations living as Catholics, even if they weren't. It's that looking, basically, again, resonances with Jewish history, looking for that bit of Jewish ancestry, and then you are to blame for enslavement, for colonization, for whatever. So I'm very suspicious, and I feel strongly about it, clearly. Okay.
Yeah, First of all, thank you a lot, Jessica.
Well, you've heard it twice now, but or variations of it.
That when you were talking about Jews moving from the Netherlands, from Amsterdam to the Caribbean, you were showing all the pull factors.
Right.
But there was also big push factors.
Yeah.
There was influx of poor Sephardics.
Yes, I haven't gotten into the poverty because we don't want to hang out with those.
And
Ashkenazi.
the rich Jews
Yeah.
they really want them to move further.
But it's not,
Partly we're moving to the
it's not just
Empire.
not just the poor Ashkenazim, it's actually how many poor Sephardim there are. So they actually start shipping them away. I didn't get into that, but thank you, Paul. They start shipping them away because there's too many poor Jews. So they say, go off to the colonies. Make your fortune there. That's in the 17th century, the early part of the 17th. Well, actually already late 17th century. It really gains traction in the 18th century when the economy in the Dutch Republic starts to decline. They invested the equivalent of about $1 million in sending poor Jews to mostly to Suriname. They want to get rid of them. And I think, yeah, you've got this Yoda Savannah, this Jewish colony in the center. Off you go. So I'm here to talk more. No, some very few do, but that's that great myth indeed of Jewish anything. They all become rich. No, there's a lot of poverty in the colonies as well. When the trade in sugar starts declining, Savannah becomes abandoned. Most move to Paramaribo. And by the 18th century, you also get more Ashkenazi Jews to become traders in Paramaribo. No, the majority are kind of middle class. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Another 10-minute break.